Hello, everyone. It got really quiet in here all of a sudden. How is everyone doing this evening? Good. Okay. So welcome to our November History Talks program. My name is Felicia Rova-Cameron. I am the Associate Curator for the Lacey Museum. I am joined by Museum Assistant Olivia Moore, who will be moderating the virtual part of the presentation at the back of the room. And joining us for tonight's program is historian and author Dave Nicandri, who will be presenting on the evolution of the Northwest Passage as a cartographic image from 1753 to 1853. So before we begin tonight's presentation, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement and some museum news. The Lacey Museum is on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian Tribe and Squaxin Island Tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized today who were absorbed or relocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who are still here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as the traditional stewards of this land since time immemorial, and their role today in taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of dispossession, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as they have today. We recommend that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. Okay, so starting in December, museum staff will be offering free guided tours for those interested in getting a first-hand look at the museum space before it's officially open to the public. Groups of up to 8 guests will be provided with a 1-hour time slot that includes a 30 to 45-minute tour, the opportunity to browse the space independently, and to ask questions about the moving process with museum staff. Registration is required and space is limited, so be sure to reserve your spot. And speaking of being open to the public, we finally have an opening date, and thank you all for being so patient with us. We know we get a lot of questions about when we're opening. So we are very excited to be back and welcome you all into our new space on Thursday, January 15th, 2026. The museum's operating hours will be Thursdays and Fridays, 11 a.m. to 3 p.m., and Saturdays, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So come down and see us. We also wanted to include some community input in one of our exhibits. One of our new exhibits, titled Learning in Lacey, has an empty locker. So we are interested to hear from you all about what you kept in your school lockers so we can think about what we can do when decorating this one. So for folks in person tonight, we do have a whiteboard over here, and feel free to write your comments on that board. And for folks watching online, feel free to leave a comment with a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We hope you'll join us next month for our December history talk with Kyle Pittman for his talk, Tribal Sovereignty, A History of Colonization and Federal Indian Policy. For tonight's presentation, we will be holding our Q&A afterwards, and for those in person, we have a microphone, so feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, and I can come around with that so folks at home can hear your question. And for folks online, again, just use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Dave Nicandri. Dave Nicandri is the former director of the Washington State Historical Society, having served in that capacity from 1987 to 2011. Sorry, Dave. When he retired from that position. The Washington State History Museum in downtown Tacoma, which opened in 1996, was his signature achievement. In recent years, Dave has authored several books that inform his talk, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, Lewis and Clark Reframed, Examining Ties to Cook, Vancouver, and Mackenzie, Captain Cook Rediscovered, Voyaging to the Icy Latitudes, and Discovering Nothing, In Pursuit of an Elusive Northwest Passage. Dave has 2 more books in development, From Juan de Fuca to John C. Fremont, Exploring Northwest Geography, Real and Imagined, and The Northwest and Other Passages, Tales from the North. Thank you, Dave, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Felicia, for that very nice introduction, and it's a pleasure to see you all here tonight, and for those who are tuning in at home. It's always good to see familiar faces from familiar contexts. In my case, it's the Valley Athletic Club, Nebraska football watch parties, or Fog and Fern coffee shop across town. So the slideshow tonight draws heavily, in fact, probably 90% of the 15 or so images are illustrations from my latest book, which is Discovering Nothing in Pursuit of a Northwest Passage. The title of my talk is actually what I wanted the title of the book to be. And though I've written now several books lately, I've yet to have a publisher title the book the way I would want it titled. But when I'm doing my talks, I can establish my own title, thank you. And so the title of the talk is The Evolution of the Northwest Passage. Before I go any farther, I want to acknowledge and thank Darlene Kemery, who does all of my graphic design and promotional literature. And if I get into trouble technologically, Darlene's always there to try to bail me out. So let's get started. I'm going to see, do I have to point this or just, there we go. Okay. So the story of the Northwest Passage, in a sense, goes all the way back to the Columbian era. By that I mean Christopher Columbus. As many of us would know from our school days, Columbus ventured out from Europe in 1492 looking for a more direct route to the trade markets of what's now Indonesia and China. Unfortunately for him, to a significant degree, unfortunately for the people living here, he stumbled upon a whole hemisphere of a continental landmass that we know as North and South America. Columbus actually did very little in that regard, but the generation that followed him over the ensuing 80 years began to generally define the outline of what we know today as North and South America. And in less than 100 years after Columbus's inadvertent encounter, the impulse that had sent him southwest into the Atlantic Ocean to begin with resurrected. In other words, the fact that Columbus might have stumbled upon, again, a whole hemisphere worth of continental landmass did not obviate the desire, the willingness, the fever to still find a direct shortcut to Asia and the Spice Islands, again, of what is now Indonesia, rather than sailing south of South America, across the Indian Ocean, past Australia, and then somehow finding one's way to those spots, where Europeans were looking for porcelain, and spices, etc. So that is when the search for the Northwest Passage began, 80 to 100 years after Columbus. The name of the term, of course, is derived from the fact that European power, the imperial powers, European commercial powers, were looking for a westerly directed shortcut that went north or west of North America that would get them to the intended destination. Every attempt to find this passage from, let's say, 1580 to 1753 came to naught because the European explorers, and their names dot all of the geography of Atlantic Canada, Baffin, Frobisher, Hudson most famously, all either hit more land or they hit ice in the Arctic, but long story short, did not find a passage through or around North America. And there the story lay until the era of when this map was published in 1753. In the decade and a half after the Russian explorers, Bering and Chirikov, began to sail east of Russia, that is to say, east of the far eastern cape of Russia, the far eastern point of Siberia, looking for other fur-bearing lands. They foundered upon some new lands that they only had the haziest understanding of. But when word of these Russian explorations and discoveries, however murkily they were understood, filtered back to the other capitals in Europe, principally Paris and London, that re-engendered a whole new era of speculation and search for the Northwest Passage, which you can see demonstrated in this particular chart, again, published in 1753. Now, several things are interesting about this. The whole eastern half of the continent is pretty well defined. I mean, there's Florida. You can see Hudson Bay up, whoops, I knew it. You can see Hudson Bay up here. And technology. This is why I take Darlene to every public program I do. It's a very touchy device. So I'm going to avoid using this. Can you advance those from back there? Okay. Should I? So on the western side of North America, you can see way down in the bottom, you can see California, which is almost an island. It's a long peninsula. But the principal feature on this map I'd like to call your attention to, in French it says mer ou baie de l'Ouest, the sea or bay of the West. And you can see it's a gigantic inlet off the Pacific Ocean that's 2 or 3 times the size of Hudson Bay, which off the Atlantic is reasonably well configured. Now, this is a facet of a commonplace phenomenon in geographic projection and speculation. In the Renaissance Enlightenment era, which is that if there were a particular feature on one side of a continent, it was thought, the term is called equipoise or counterpoise. So if there's a big bay off the Atlantic Ocean, which we know as Hudson Bay, which you see off to the upper right, then there's going to be a big bay off the Pacific Ocean. I mean, that's just how people thought geography worked. Most famously in American history, this entails the Lewis and Clark story, because there was the well-known Appalachian Mountains, well-defined by the era of Thomas Jefferson. The width and height was reasonably well defined, and so they thought there would be a mountain range just like that, as far from the Pacific Ocean as the Appalachians are from the Atlantic, the same height, the same complexity, and of course that's completely wrong. But this is how speculative geography worked in the Enlightenment era. So this is the best comprehension and projection of what the northwestern half of North America looked like in 1753, which is about when what we call the French and Indian War, and in European circles, the 7 Years' War between France and Great Britain was just kicking off. Let's go to the next slide. I referenced Russian exploration. This is the last map that was published in London based upon Prussian sources, informed by Russian sources, about what the North Pacific, how the North Pacific Ocean was configured. You see off here on the left, you can see the reasonable projection of the Kamchatka Peninsula. I'm going to have to seek recourse to this because it's just too interesting, too much technology. What is particularly interesting about this map is that Alaska is an island. And you can see the Aleutians straggling across the northern Pacific, tucked almost all the way underneath the Kamchatka Peninsula. This is clearly, and way over here to the right, is the far northwestern tip of North America, published 1775. This is clearly a garbled understanding of what Russian explorers and geographers communicated to other elements of European geographic circles. In fact, it's entirely possible that the Russians knew better than this geographic projection, but they purposefully mystified it so that it would confound people when they encountered it, which is exactly what would happen when Captain Cook sailed in these waters in a voyage that left in 1776. Let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to mess with the advance, but I think I can use the highlight button. So let's get to Captain Cook here. So the way the story plays out, as I said earlier, every attempt to identify a northwest passage from the Atlantic side of the ocean up to the 1750s and 60s had failed, in part because it's not really there, but I'll come back to that notion later. But they would hit ice, they'd hit land. And so the thought was, Captain Cook having two very successful voyages to the Pacific under his belt by the mid-1770s, let's send Captain Cook to look for the Northwest Passage. But rather than looking for it like everyone else had from the Atlantic side, let's send him to the Pacific Ocean, which he had already sailed across extensively on two previous voyages. Maybe he can find the Northwest Passage by working backwards. That is, looking for it on the backside of the continent rather than the side of the continent that faces Europe. And so this is actually an inset from a larger projection that accompanied the atlas to Cook's third and final voyage. It just shows the Pacific Basin, which was Cook's primary arena of endeavor. Several interesting things, and the lines that, the yellow lines at the bottom, for example, denote his track on his second voyage. The red line that comes around Cape Horn of South America and trends up towards Tahiti, that was his first voyage. And then in the northern hemisphere, the green line is Cook's track for his third and final voyage, the one on which he was looking for the Northwest Passage. Now, what's interesting about this map, which in my book on Captain Cook, I call the first modern map of the world. Again, you're just seeing the Pacific Basin, because I want to focus people's attention on this. But it's the first modern map of the world. In other words, someone looking at that map would think, yeah, that's kind of the way the world looks. I mean, the Korean Peninsula and Japan are a little funkily depicted, and Alaska doesn't quite look like that, but the ocean, that's as wide as the Pacific is. And indeed, and all the island chains, many of which Cook identified cartographically, populate the lines south of the equator. The Hawaiian Islands are here. But our story involves North America, or a passage through or around it. And what's noteworthy about Cook's map is that it fully and finally depicted the northwesterly trend line of the North American west coast, ever moving north and west all the way up to the Arctic, which it does. Cook's map also is the first one that showed the subcontinental dimensions of Alaska. I just showed you the map that was published in 1775, the year before he sailed, where Alaska is an island. Now you can see that, in fact, it's of subcontinental scope, and it shows the relative narrow distance between the Far East Cape of Russia, the Siberian coast, and Cape Prince of Wales, which is the most westerly point of North America, up there. In fact, on a clear day, in the middle of the Bering Strait, one could see one continent or another. And so, but to the point of the Northwest Passage, when Cook gets up through the Bering Strait, up into the Arctic Ocean, he hits ice, the same substance that confounded every explorer looking for the Northwest Passage from the Atlantic side of the ocean. He exits, comes down to Hawaii, where he's expecting to winter over in advance of a second season of exploration, where he is murdered by the Hawaiians on February 14th, 1779, the original St. Valentine's Day massacre. Now, the story proceeds from there because inadvertently, one of the kind of odd contingent aspects of Cook's third voyage, when the expedition made landfall on the North American coast at a spot we now know as Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island, which was their principal temperate zone and only temperate zone landing spot on Cook's third voyage, the men, anticipating a summer up in the Arctic, acquired every bear pelt, bear rug, and sea otter mittens and ermine. I mean, every pelt they could get, they picked up from the native people living in Nootka Sound, and they'd buy these things for a nail, for a coat button. only to discover at the end of the voyage, when Cook's been long dead, that when they get to, initially actually over here in Kamchatka briefly, but more particularly when they get to China, that the sea otter pelt that any regular seaman among the 200 or 300 on the voyage, any sea otter pelt they might have picked up for a nail or a button would sell for 100 or 150 Spanish dollars. In other words, a small fortune. And in fact, Cook's successor once removed, because Cook's immediate successor also died, but the successor after that, he had to put off a mutiny because the crew at this point, which is 1779, they didn't want to go back to England. Now realizing what a button or a nail could procure in terms of wealth, they wanted to go back to the Northwest Coast and do more trading. That was suppressed as an incipient mutiny. But word spread rapidly in the commercial trading circles, the British East India Company, and in fact, the report of Cook's third voyage, which is of course published posthumously, contained a whole business plan. It's like a business prospectus of how to conduct the maritime fur trade on the Northwest Coast, the time of year to arrive, the best spot to trade furs, supplies for trade, etc. And this just sent off a rush to the Northwest Coast, the onset of what historians know and have called the Northwest Maritime Fur Trade. Next slide. The most famous of these navigators, or the ones that most Americans would be conversant with, would be Robert Gray, who shipped the Columbia with the Lady Washington. We've all seen the Lady Washington replica. That's the era we're talking about. Those ships got out here. Now, they were Americans. Most of the fur traders were British. But they were out in these waters, and they would be making discoveries like where the mouth of the Columbia River is. In fact, the Columbia River is named after Robert Gray's ship, famously. We know Robert Gray because Grays Harbor County is the adjoining county to the west, but the most famous of these maritime fur traders was a fellow by the name of John Mears, and this is the map that was published in his account of fur trading and exploration on the Northwest Coast in 1790, or 16 years after Cook's third voyage account was published. This is interesting in several respects because Mears and all the other fur traders began because whereas Cook didn't have any interest in exploring the mid-latitudes, the 40s and 50s, because any Northwest Passage was going to be 60 degrees of latitude or higher, he kind of passed by our part of the world pretty quickly, which historians for generations have misunderstood, because how could he miss the Columbia River? How could he miss the Strait of Juan de Fuca? Because he was told not to look for anything at these latitudes. Any passage would have to be 60 degrees of latitude or higher. But the fur traders who have more time and inclination to poke into every cove and bay on the Northwest Coast, they begin to find a far more intricate Northwest coastline. If we can go back a slide, notice how Cook's definition of the coast, I mean, there's some definition to it, but it's generally just kind of a straight line up. Not the complex, almost labyrinthine inside passage, Alaska panhandle country that many of us might be familiar with either from looking at a map or perhaps traveling. So let's go back to the other slide. So the fur traders are beginning to find a much more complicated coastline than Cook's voyage would have otherwise suggested, up to and including a feature on this map where Mears speculated that this hint of what would later be perceived and accurately depicted as Vancouver Island merely shielded the larger part of the notion of the great inland sea. In other words, the idea of that great Bay of the West, it was resurrected because all of these islands seem to be pointing into recesses that might take one deeper into North America. So the point I'm trying to make here is that Cook was looking for a Northwest Passage that was navigable at sea level from the Atlantic to the Pacific or vice versa. The fur traders, by beginning to propagate the idea that maybe that old French projection from 1753, the one with the big Bay of the West, maybe they were right after all, and that the land that some of these people are exploring it merely shields it from view, and therefore the Northwest Passage transitions from a direct ocean-to-ocean route to a shortcut across the continent from the Hudson Bay to the east and this big bay here, and therefore the Northwest Passage is the spot between these two big inlets off of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, respectively. Therefore, the Northwest Passage evolves as a geographic concept. Again, direct saltwater to saltwater to an intermediating neck of land that may indeed still be several hundred miles wide. But it's a lot quicker going across that than sailing all the way under the Tierra del Fuego or around Cape Horn across the Indian Ocean, or still trying fatefully to try to find a route over the top of North America. So the Northwest Passage is going through an evolution. Next slide, please. Now, concurrently with all of this maritime fur trading, the terrestrial fur traders are reading the same accounts of Cook's men in China from 1780 that the maritime fur traders in Bombay, Calcutta, and Hong Kong had read or heard about. And so there was an aspect of Cook's third voyage account that was, in fact, his biggest geographic mistake. And that is that when he sailed into Cook Inlet, where the city of Anchorage, Alaska is, Anchorage named because Cook anchored there in the search for the Northwest Passage. Cook Inlet doesn't lead to Hudson Bay or the Atlantic Ocean, as we all know. We know that because Cook and others determined that it doesn't do that. But Cook made a mistake in presuming, based upon his service in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, on the St. Lawrence River, which he helped map in preparation of the British attack at the French fortress at Quebec. He thought that Cook Inlet was like the St. Lawrence Bay of the West. See, here's where the principle of equipoise and counterpoise comes again. Having been on the St. Lawrence River in the battle for Quebec and seen the Gulf of St. Lawrence, he thinks the Cook Inlet is like the Western version of that system, and therefore Cook Inlet is fed, is fed by a big river, which was named by others, not him, as Cook's River, leaving from some lakes somewhere ill-defined in the north interior of North America. So now we have competing notions of the second version of the Northwest Passage, the shortcut between the big bays, and the fur traders like Peter Pond, whose map, this is also published in 1790, the same year as Meares's map that I showed you earlier. Pond and his successor, Alexander Mackenzie, and I'll get to him, they began to imagine that it's possible to capitalize on the maritime fur trade along the Northwest coast by getting there from the Great Lakes through Lake Winnipeg, Lake Athabasca, Great Slave Lake, and finding the headwaters of Cook's River, get to Cook Inlet or Prince William Sound and access the rich peltry of the Northwest coast by an overland route. Not technically overland, it's by river and lake, but it's a continental route. So the concept of the Northwest Passage continues to undergo an evolutionary process. Let's go to the next slide. So that's 1790. Now, this was my most exciting find when I was writing Discovering Nothing, because I found this map at the State Library. No one really knew how valuable and rare it was. It was kind of on the wall behind the reading desk there, and I'm looking at it one day, and I find an inconsistency in it, because I recognize that the table up at the top, I'm about to lose my temper. The table at the top says Northwest Coast of America and the Northeast Coast of Asia explored in the years 1778, 79. Well, that's when Cook is exploring the North Pacific. But the geography of the Northwest Coast is completely different from what Cook saw. you can see down here the first intimation of what would later be renamed the Strait of Juan de Fuca. That's in my next book. Let me just highlight that for a second. Juan de Fuca was a real person, but the voyage that is attributed to him was completely fabricated by himself, principally, in order to get money for another voyage to the Pacific. But that's in the next book. But you see here, north of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, you see this, the emergence of this very complicated coast. This is the northwest coast that we're all familiar with, not the relatively straight line of Cook's era. And you can see Cook's track up here where he hit the ice. You can see the Alaska Peninsula, etc. So this map is very rare and valuable, published in 1790, because it shows the state of geographic comprehension of the northwest quadrant of North America on the eve of the next big development in the history of the evolution of the Northwest Passage, which was the voyage of George Vancouver. Let's go to the next slide. So Vancouver had sailed with Cook on the second voyage that circumnavigated Antarctica, and he was on the third voyage, both as a midshipman. Of no great distinction, really. I mean, if you just stayed out of trouble, that you were good with any captain. But there were more noteworthy figures on Cook's third voyage, like the sailing master, a guy by the name of Bligh, who would go on to fame, rather infamy in another regard, with the mutiny on the Bounty. But Vancouver, whose primary mission actually was diplomatic, the British and the Spanish had gotten into a hassle up at Nootka Sound regarding prerogatives around a trading post, again, a fur trading post the Spanish had up there. And Vancouver was to come out here and settle the affair with some counterpart from the Spanish realm. But he was given a concurrent mission, which was basically amounts to this: find the west coast of North America, somewhere in the mid-latitudes of what we would now call the California coast. And just keep North America to your right. Is that the starboard, Neil? Keep the North American continent to your starboard until you have exhausted every possible recourse that any of these numerous inlets might lead to that great inland sea that had been talked about for the previous half century. And that's what Vancouver did. Over the course of 3 summers, he left England on April 1, 1791, and yes, he knew he was leaving on April Fool's Day. The summers of 1792 and 93, he would take a section of the northwest coast, map it exhaustively, and the result is really, much like Cook's was the first modern map of the world, this is the first modern map of the northwest coast. Anyone looking at that would determine, yeah, that's pretty much the way the northwest coast looks, including among its more prominent features, God help me with this button, the delineation of Vancouver Island, which he actually wanted to call Vancouver and Quadra Island, Quadra being his counterpart from Spain. But things happening the way they do, particularly in that time, the Quadra term fell into disuse, and we know it as Vancouver Island. Although Gray had found the mouth of the Columbia River, Vancouver detached one of his men upriver on the Columbia, and the first extensive, the bottom one, the lower 110 miles of the Columbia River were navigated and charted by Captain Broughton, who was one of Vancouver's adjutants. So, there's not only no direct saltwater to saltwater Northwest Passage that Cook was looking for, because you'll inevitably hit the ice, and now there's no bay, or there's no narrow-ish neck of land between the Hudson Bay. You just simply have this labyrinthine coastline, but it doesn't lead anywhere, including the Strait of Juan de Fuca. My joke about this part is that Vancouver sailed into the Strait of Juan de Fuca hoping he might end up at Hudson Bay, and he ended up in Tumwater instead. And that's barely an exaggeration, because Vancouver actually sailed straight, and I'm going to have to rely on a navigator like Neil. What's the Dana Passage, which is actually named after a subsequent expedition, Wilkes, in the 1840s. But Dana Passage, that body of water that goes over the top of all of the inlets, like Budd Inlet, Eld Inlet, that is Dana Passage. Cook actually sailed that, Vancouver sailed that into Eld Inlet. The more detailed survey was done by Peter Puget, which is why we have one of his lieutenants, Puget Sound. And there I have to digress for one of my favorite topics is because I've talked, I'm about 2/3 of the way through this story. One of my other favorite ones in terms of evolution is the migration of the geographic concept of Puget Sound. Vancouver meant Puget Sound to be the waters Puget explored in detail, south of what we call the Tacoma Narrows. A sound is like a hand. There's the palm, which is kind of the main body, and then there's the fingers that come off it. So if you put a hand upside down, it looks like all the inlets in the lower portion of Puget Sound. Now, and the water north of there, Vancouver called Admiralty Inlet. Today, Admiralty Inlet is the narrow band of water between Port Townsend and Whidbey Island. I mean, it's like 5 miles long. But Vancouver considered the inlet to be all of the waters south of that narrow passage, including Puget Sound. But that's a huge digression. That's also in one of my other future books. We'll have to save that for a future talk. Let's get going, Darlene. Let's go to the next slide before I get into trouble here. So whereas the maritime opportunity for the Northwest Passage seems finally have been vanquished by Vancouver's chart and work, which was published in 1798, the terrestrial the sector hadn't quite given up the ghost on this topic. And here we have the most important map ever published in the history of Western North America. My friends from Tumwater Valley know I'm prone to hyperbole. I'm just throwing it out there. This is the most important map published in the history of Western North America. It's Alexander Mackenzie's track map, published in 1801 in a book that was titled Voyages from Montreal. Mackenzie was an employee of the Northwest Trading Company, which was the great competitor to the Hudson Bay Company. You might have seen my jacket that I was wearing here tonight. It's over there. They later, in the 1820s, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company merged. But at this point in time, to turn into the 19th century, the Northwest Company and the Hudson Bay Company were inveterate enemies in the terrestrial fur trade. Mackenzie was Peter Pond's successor. I showed you Pond's map a little earlier. Pond, because he was a fur trader, perhaps, was a very problematic figure. He was always getting in fights with people. He killed two or three other fur traders, and he was recalled. And so the assignment was given to Mackenzie to see if he could extend the work that would take a trade originating in Montreal, heading up the Great Lakes, here Superior, through Lake Winnipeg. It's that old lake and river system I showed you earlier, starting from, I've lost my own, Lake Athabasca right here, which is north and west of modern Edmonton, Alberta. Very northern part of Alberta, you can find Lake Athabasca on the border with the Northwest Territories. That was Mackenzie's jumping off point for what he thought would be a single, but ended up being 2 other river voyages of exploration. The one in 1789, he heads out, goes to the north side of Great Slave Lake, finds a river, but runs into some mountains that take him not to the Pacific, but to the Arctic Ocean. It's the Mackenzie River that's named after him to this day. And he knew he had reached the An Ocean. I mean, he could see the ice, he could see whales, but it wasn't an outlet to Cook's River. And so he went back to England, studied cartography and navigation more closely, and tried a second time. Again, that was the first one read to the Arctic was 1789. And actually, he got to the Arctic Ocean the day the Bastille fell in Paris, coincidentally. So he tries again in 1793 after some training overseas, and that's shown here in yellow. Again from Lake Athabasca, and he runs into some natives on what we know as the upper reaches of the Fraser River, but he thinks is the upper reaches of the Columbia River. And that's a very complicated geography. It would take David Thompson the better part of a decade to figure that out. But he's on the upper reaches of a river, and the native people tell him, you are foolhardy to follow this water all the way to tidewater because you will be dashed to pieces in the rapids that we know as Hellgate. Any of you familiar with Hellgate on the Fraser River? That's what the native people were trying to argue him out of. So he went cross lots. He abandoned the Fraser River, which again he thinks is the Columbia, and goes and reaches the ocean out here near modern Bella Coola, British Columbia, on the central British Columbia coast. Interestingly enough, he misses Vancouver by 6 weeks. I mean, they almost ran into each other with completely different objectives and timelines. They barely missed each other. But Vancouver got there first, and when Mackenzie gets to Tidewater, he's talking to the native people, and they keep telling him Vancouver. They're trying to tell him about a guy that looks like him has already been there, and he doesn't piece this all together till years afterwards. But this is interesting enough, but it's not the most important part of this map, which is why because I've yet to get to why this is the most important map in the history of Western America. And that's because this map was included in the book Voyages from Montreal, which a friend of Thomas Jefferson's called his attention to over the winter of 1801 and 2. And the concluding few paragraphs of that book, in which this map was located, said basically, I, Alexander Mackenzie, I'm putting myself in Mackenzie's voice, I, Alexander Mackenzie, have discovered a route from the Atlantic through the Great Lakes, through the rivers and lakes of the North American West. They will reach tidewater on the Pacific Ocean, and it is a route so practical it will envelop the fur trade and keep the Americans from being able to make any further inroads into this very profitable trade. And those were the words that prompted Tom. I'm getting ahead of my story. Those are the words that prompted Thomas Jefferson to designate Meriwether Lewis, because he needed to get his own guys out into the field to try to combat the geographic intelligence and the strategic import of what Mackenzie had included in his book published in 1801. And that is the origin of what we know as the Lewis and Clark expedition. We don't have time for me to explicate that in all of its detail. But I think you can safely conclude from an introduction of Lewis and Clark how that figures prominently in the history of the American West. And we'll just simply have to leave that there for now while we stay focused on the main thing, which gets us to our next map. This was published by the American War Department. It was actually known as that back in those days. Sorry. 1803, for use by Meriwether Lewis in the field. And you can see several obvious and conventional features. You see the Great Lakes over on the right. You see the Northwest coast, including Vancouver Island, reasonably well articulated there. You see the lakes of what we would now know as the Canadian North. But I call your attention to some other aspects of this map, right here in the center of it, which is the notion of a conjectural South Fork of the great river of the West, please, that emerges at 46 North, the Columbia River. Now, this map is the essential example of what I would call the geography of hope. Notice how there's no mountain ranges All you have to do is go up the Mississippi and Missouri River, and you will find a stream that'll take you to the mouth of the Columbia River. But it's going to be a snap. You can get out and back in one season of exploration. Again, the geography of hope. Again, we don't have time tonight to go into all the detail of the Lewis and Clark expedition, but I can tell you the outcome in a single slide, which we will get to next, which is William Clark's projection of the North American West in the wake of the Lewis and Clark expedition. This is the very antithesis of the geography of hope, because it accurately depicts the numerous north-south mountain ranges in central and western Montana, northern Idaho, or for that matter, the eastern Washington, our own state. A completely impractical travel route, although when Meriwether Lewis got back to St. Louis in September of 1806, he wrote a letter to Thomas Jefferson dutifully reporting, "Sir, I have found a route that'll take us from the American Midwest, some other drainages to the Atlantic seaboard, to the mouth of the Columbia River. We can take this, that, and the other item across country, of course, which is all baloney." Lewis and Clark did not find a workable Northwest Passage. I'm not saying there was no value to the enterprise, but its primary objective, which was to find a competing transcontinental trade route akin to the one Mackenzie outlined, completely came to naught. Now, at this point, you would think, because this is the third version of the Northwest Passage that has come to naught. Direct ocean to ocean, Cook, doesn't exist. The shortcut between the Hudson Bay and the Bay of the West, Vancouver demolished that. And now you've got William Clark drawing a map, again, the very antithesis of a workable trade route. And in fact, the American colony in the Northwest over the Oregon Trail, it wouldn't follow any country that Lewis and Clark went over, but it came through what's now southern Wyoming over South Pass and through a more southerly route. So you would think that after all this time that the Northwest Passage was finally over. I mean, the dream had died. But, next slide. The idea of the Northwest Passage had such a fix on the popular imagination, commercial imagination, entrepreneurial imagination, that when nature failed to provide a Northwest Passage, one was built in the form of the Transcontinental Railroad. And this chart from 1853 is the westerlymost of a three-map set prepared by Isaac Stevens, which is a name that should otherwise be resonant with many of you, because he's the fellow that negotiated the Medicine Creek Treaty that Felicia alluded to at the beginning of that's how we think of Stevens, as the treaty negotiator. But it actually came west as an explorer looking for a railroad route, because the technology had evolved sufficiently that the centuries-old dream of linking commerce from the Atlantic Basin to the Pacific Basin, technology seemed to have finally made this a reality. This would happen now, or could happen. Now, as a practical matter, a railroad wasn't built in the immediate aftermath, and Stevens was one of several railroad expeditions that left the Midwest in 1853. The Secretary of War that year, by the way, or that in the Franklin Pierce administration, was a guy by the name of Jefferson Davis. He was inclined to favor a more southerly route for a railroad to California and the Pacific Slope. Go figure, but it's true. So sectional differences were such, one couldn't build a railroad till after the Civil War, when one was. First with the Union Pacific, Central Pacific, but then later, and we'll go to our last couple of slides, by the Northern Pacific Railroad, the route that Stevens surveyed in the corridor for which in 1853, or what you see here, the Canadian Pacific Railway, which served the same function north of the 49th parallel, finished about the same time as the Northern Pacific. Now, the most interesting part of this map to me, which is worth talking about, because you would guess that a Canadian Transcontinental Railroad would roughly follow this path from the Great Lakes west, but I call your attention to one place on this map in particular, because it gets to the heart of our story. Come on. Come on. It's not. Port Moody is the western terminus of the great Canadian Transcontinental Railroad. Now, William Cornelius Van Horn, who was an American, by the way, and the general manager of the CPR, thinking about it, thought, that name will just simply not do this. It's so prosaic. He wanted a name for the terminal city on the Pacific that was kind of resonant of what the CPR accomplished in terms of linking Canada, of linking the Atlantic and the Pacific trade, that ancient dream. And so he named the city Vancouver, because that was a name from this history that I've spent the last hour talking about, that to him seemed to symbolize in wooden ties and steel, concrete materials nonetheless, but that symbolized the great epic. He thought of his railroad as being part of the same historical drama that went all the way back in some sense to Columbus, but at least to Vancouver. And so the western city, the terminal western city of the CPR, was renamed Vancouver, to the constant and perpetual angst and anxiety of the people living in Vancouver, Washington, which has always had to live in its shadow. So we're nearly done with the story. We'll go to the last slide. Because in an interesting twist of fate, given the pace of global warming, the Northwest Passage that Cook looked for in the 1770s is actually coming into being in a sense, because the rate of diminution of the ice is so rapid that if Captain Cook were to sail the same route this year, or this past summer or next summer, that he took in 1778, he'd be able to get through, probably without not much difficulty. And so there was a route. The Northwest Passage was finally delineated. The conclusive voyage was Amundsen's. There's some famous, Sir John Franklin. He got lost in the ice. He died prematurely. I read one time, if you die prematurely, it's a great career move. Meriwether Lewis, Captain Cook, Sir John Franklin all died, but they're the most famous explorer, Henry Hudson. I mean, if you want to be known in history, I mean, who remembers Alexander Mackenzie or Peter Pond? I mean, they're non-entities to most of you because they lived, but the guys who died prematurely, they're the ones who we remember. Anyway, I'm having too much fun, Mark. Anyway, so Amundsen in 1903 through 1906 makes a transit of the Northwest Passage. And, in an odd sort of way, what's happening now in the Arctic is of a piece with what I described happening on the Northwest coast in the 1780s and 90s in the 15 or 20 years after Captain Cook. In that there's a gold, not literally for gold, but there is a rush of commercial and international activity in the Arctic basin. The same of a piece with what happened. I mean, they're planting flags on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, and they're making all kinds of deals, and the native people are in a great state of flux about what's happening to their terrain and their prerogatives. So what's playing out now in the first third of the 21st century has, to me, a lot of echoes to what played out on the Northwest coast in the last quarter of the 18th century. So that's the great sweep of the story, the evolution of the Northwest Passage. It's all detailed in part or in whole. This is like public television. You do a commercial early, you do a commercial late. So these are my books that Felicia was so kind to mention in her introduction. I've got copies of all of these. If anyone's interested, I'll be happy to help you out with a transaction. So I think we'll stop there for questions here or online. Yes, sir. Wait a minute, you need this.
Yes.
On the previous slide, I saw a big blue dot for the Black River. Could you help us understand that?
Let's go back one, Darlene. Oh, yes. The fellow who finally pieced together the mystery of what happened to Sir John Franklin, Hudson Bay Company trader by the name of Ray, found remains of Franklin's expedition emanating from Back River and to those other blue dots. He found evidence of what had happened to Franklin's expedition in the 1840s. So that's why this is actually an illustration from another book, not mine, but it's the best way I have of wrapping up the Northwest Passage story. Are there any questions online or here? We'll give them time. I'll take a swig of this water here. Yes, sir.
The topic ends in 1853, so that's when we come up with the railroad routes?
Correct.
But not the construction of the railroad routes.
True.
So it's still a theoretical.
Yes, but yeah, that's a good question to help clarify my intent regarding the title. Thank you, because it's the search rather than the fruition of the because that I'm talking about. So the last piece of the search for the Northwest Passage, because I failed to make this point with this slide up here. So the railroad surveys all commence in 1853. Nothing gets built because of sectionalism and pending Civil War. And a fellow by the name of McClure actually discerns. Anyone here been up in McClure Strait? It runs across the top of Banks Island here. So McClure in 1853 figured out that although there was ice here, and he got icebound here, he was able to see that if one could simply traverse the ice, one could get out over to the Atlantic Ocean. And he's generally, although somewhat contentiously, credited with being the actual discoverer of the Northwest Passage. Discover in quotes. But Amundsen was the first one actually to transect the route. And even then, he overwintered in the ice 2 years in order to make it through. So McClure 1853, Stevens 1853 kind of ends the search for the Northwest Passage. Yes, sir.
So you say that that map was just hanging in a library and nobody knew the value of it. Is it in a better home now? Do they have it framed?
Can we go back to that one, Darlene? It was framed where I found it. No, forward, going the other way. There. I could give a whole talk just on this map. And I'll just tease it a little bit. Let's go back to what I mentioned at the time, which is it's titled A Map of the Northwest Coast in 1778, 1779, but it's showing geographic detail discerned as late as 1790. Well, how do you make sense of that? As you may or may not know, maps of this vintage were engravings, which is to say they were routed or etched in copper, negatively, in the negative. So everything had to be done reverse so that when you put ink on the engraving and did a press, you'd get a positive image, like what you see here. And this also was tinted a little bit after market treatment. So what happened is that the original copper plate was somewhere in the British Admiralty in London. Somebody got the bright idea, let's do an updated map of the North Pacific using the plate that was done for Cook's chart from 1778, 79. And this whole portion of the map was hammered flat, was eliminated and re-engraved with the subsequent generation of geographic information. So I want to give a talk to my Rotary Club someday. It's titled A Book and a Map. And this is the map that's going to be in that talk. But yes, it's much better taken care of. It's digitized. My book is the first time this map ever appeared in print, and there are very few places that it exists internationally. Michael? Yeah.
We do have an online question, if
Okay.
you want me to do that one first. Oh, that's fine, yeah. Oh, okay. Somebody online is asking, is there any indication that Native Americans made through the route, as you guys say, prior to white men?
Oh, of course, yes. One of my favorite stories from the Lewis and Clark saga is that rather famously in the lore of Lewis and Clark, one of the men's hatchets was lost sort of around Hood River or that part of the lower Columbia, westbound in 1805. When Lewis and Clark got back to Fort Mandan the summer of 1806, they found the hatchet there. In other words, it had made it all the way across the North American West as a trade item from basically Stevenson, Washington to Bismarck, North Dakota. And so one thing I've learned myself is our sense of how much geographic information and concourse and traveling native people, we have a completely naive idea about how encompassing that travel was, the knowledgeability of it. The difference, of course, is that Western civilization depicted things in a normative fashion that we're all trained and accustomed to reading. Whereas native intelligence was never communicated in that sense, because rivers and lakes and oceans did different things in their worldviews than what Western Europeans thought of as the utility of the very same substances and bodies of water or tracts of land. So I hope that answers that question. Michael, you had one.
Thank you. Fantastic. This is very interesting. Thank you. I noticed in some of the earlier maps, and maybe it was just my mind's eye seeing it, but the Great Slave Lake shows up a couple of times.
Yes.
In some earlier renderings of the map.
Yes.
Was that a addition, or was there explorers that had identified this large lake as a thing, and a thing of consequence towards the Northwest Passage?
If we can go back to Peter Pond's map, Darlene, it would be earlier than this. There. Pond and Mackenzie are, now the term slave is itself kind of problematic and curious. It was a term given to a native people who lived in that area who were slaves to Cree people who lived on the shores of Hudson Bay. So it became the Slave Lake. So that's the origin of the nomenclature, approximately. So Pond and Mackenzie figured out the dimensions and the placement of generally speaking. I mean, this map is very imprecise. But the relationship of bodies of water to one another are as Lake Athabasca. I lost my clicker, maybe a good thing. Just saying, Ed. Lake Athabasca down here, again, that's northern Alberta. There was Fort Chipewyan was on the western end of that. The Slave River flows out of that, the Slave Lake. What is otherwise curious about, and I passed over this at the time, notice that, and this is how geographers covered their tracks. I mean, they were really wily people in many respects. No one ever likes to be proved wrong. So in order to hedge their bets cartographically, Pond, when he published this, has an outlet of Slave Lake going both to the Arctic and to Cook Inlet and Prince William Sound on the Pacific. So again, he didn't know which way. It actually flows, as Mackenzie would prove in his wake, that the Slave Lake emanates, the waters emanate into the Arctic Ocean up here at Beaufort. So I don't know if I've answered your question, Michael, but that's about all I can add about Slave Lake. And it's, I mean, I've been up and, I mean, Slave Lake and Athabasca, I mean, these are huge lakes that almost no one knows anything about in North America. Great Bear Lake, mammoth stretches of water. And for better or for worse, they're kind of out of sight, out of mind in the Canadian North. But, and the Mackenzie River itself, which is a magnificent drainage and a huge river system. It's not as big as the Mississippi, but I've been on the at the mouth of the Mackenzie River, and the size of it is just staggering. But anyway, that's all I have to say about Slave Lake. And that might, unless there's another question, that might be all I have to say about anything. So
Can we get a round of applause
Thank
for
you.
Dave?